Okay, I'll just go ahead and get started because I know we have a short amount of time and there's a little bit to cover, and we would like to try to get a discussion going as well. So first off, let me welcome you everybody to this open session for implementing post-disaster permanent housing retrofit for recovery and resilience. My name is Alua Shaun, and I am the Engineering Program Associate with Build Change. Um, Before we get started, I wanted to clarify the interactive intent of this discussion. Throughout this session, we'll be polling various questions to get feedback from you. So on your screen, you'll see a QR code and a website. You can either use your mobile device or go straight to that website, and it'll take you to the presentation. Um, we'll have some space for discussions, but we'll definitely have to monitor for time. And even if you can't speak up, we encourage you to add any questions and comments in the chat, and we'll try our best to get to them. Moving on, I'm joined by my colleagues Lizzie Blasdell-Collins, who's our Vice President of Engineering, Leva Shrestha, who's our Lead Engineer for the Asia Pacific region, and Luis Foltz, who's the other Engineering Program Associate. Again, we're with Build Change, which is a nonprofit social enterprise operating more like an engineering company. Our mission, much like I'm sure other people here, is to save lives in earthquakes and typhoons, with the goal of creating permanent change in construction practices to ones that are disaster resistant. We work with governments, builders, communities, and local organizations in places such as Colombia and Haiti, Indonesia, Nepal, and the Philippines. So for our first question, we just wanted to get an understanding of who is here with us today. Basically, what is your background? Are you with management, finance, you technical, you social? Awesome. Awesome. Interesting to see we have both technical and finance and some social. Oh, and we have some other. It would be interesting to see some of the professions if you want to just also type them in the Microsoft Teams chat. Um, yeah, moving on to the next question. Um, do you have experience with retrofitting? This is today we're talking about retrofitting, and we wanted to see, if people have had experience. Okay. Okay, cool. Some definitely have had experience. A couple, not sure what it is. It's a good thing you're joining the session today. Awesome. Okay. Well, I guess most people know what retrofitting is, but for those that don't, I'll just give a little short intro to it. So what is retrofitting and what is retrofitting for resilient housing? Resilient houses are, first off, disaster resistant. They are able to protect people and assets in the face of multiple hazards. They are healthy and secure with adequate water, sanitation, ventilation, light, access, space, and security. And they are affordable, especially for low and middle income households. And they sometimes can be a financial asset and or a place of business that stimulates economic opportunity by being adaptable to multiple uses. and thus protecting a family's property investment. And lastly, they are local. They are built using materials, skills, and tools that are appropriate for the culture and the climate. And we can create resilient housing using solutions that already exist with interventions that target disaster risk reduction measures such as ring beams and vertical ties, repair damages to roofing and walls, and improve the habitability with wash and a focus on natural lighting and ventilation. And finally, not forgetting the finishes like tiling, plastering, and painting with the ability to expand in the future, both horizontally and vertically. And how can we reach an effective retrofit program? Well, we have found that there are three major barriers that need to be addressed to implement a lasting change: people, money, and technology. First off, people, homeowners, community members, and donors. People must want a safer building. And to achieve this, we need to build awareness. We need to find the solutions, financial and technical, that appeal to homeowners. And this means that the owners must be involved in the building designs to ensure they are acceptable, but also that the owners believe that they are safer. Secondly, money has to be available for the homeowners and communities to be able to afford safe construction practices. The money can come from communities and owners themselves, or from loans, or from government subsidies or donor grants. Compliance incentives and conditional cash grants can be levied to promote safer construction. And finally, technology. This includes the technical know-how and applying the right building technologies with clear guidelines for design and construction that must be locally available, widely known, and cost efficient. A successful recovery program happens when all three of these are brought together and viewed through this lens. So I wanted to open it up to everybody here, but what type of retrofitting programs have you participated in? I know that some people have answered yes. And where and what hazards, what intervention goals? I'd like to call on some people to give some of their experience. Um, you can either write it out in the chat, or if you raise your hand in the team speak, I'd like to call on some people. Okay, cool. School buildings in Nepal, in Haiti, construction and training, earthquakes, tsunamis and cyclones. In the Philippines, I was there definitely after Yolanda. Okay. Um, and Colombia as well. Prevention. That's something we definitely would like to think about and talk about. How can we prevent a disaster from happening from natural hazards? Definitely. Floods and conflict. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you all for your responses. If you have any other experiences, please, again, write them in the chat. It'll be interesting to see what those are. Now, moving on, and now as to why retrofitting is important. In this age of continued and increasing threat of natural hazards, there is also an increasing deficit in the quality of formal housing, where governments have struggled to meet housing demand or the formal housing market has been inaccessible or unsuitable to newcomers. Rapid urbanization has led to an increase in informal construction. Informally constructed buildings are built without a licensed engineer or designer, typically do not conform with building standards, or may use precarious or substandard materials. After a disaster, the housing sector typically sees a larger percentage of losses, a larger economic impact, and these buildings can become damaged or destroyed, leading to distrust in the built environment and leaving communities susceptible to social issues such as gender based violence. The aim of a successful retrofitting program is to move these damaged buildings back into the safe, available housing stock faster and with resilience for the future. So, our next poll is for those that have participated in retrofit programs, or even if you haven't, how would you characterize the biggest challenges you've experienced or think you would experience in implementing housing recovery after a disaster? Would they be financial issues, technical issues, social, political, or something other than those? Yeah, money's usually an issue. Oh, a lot more social and political policy and red tape. Interesting. So not as much technical as both the financial and the social political. Interesting. Oh, more technical. Let's give it a little bit more time. Awesome. And within those challenges, what specifically were you thinking about? Again, this is an open-ended question. Please feel free to write. It'd be interesting to see what you all were thinking about. Lack of funding is a big one. Lack of funding is always a big one. You can have so many ideas and have programs ready to go, but if you don't have the funding, it will go nowhere. Programs will close down. Definitely, this feeds into the awareness, people's perception of retrofitting. Um, how can we transfer all of this technical knowledge and know-how and spread that to the masses and make it easy and digestible for builders and non-technical people to create retrofit programs and to have these safer construction practices and understanding why certain structural elements are needed in certain areas. Definitely lack of awareness, no national standards, working through again, yes, the local authorities, licenses, um, all that red tape. Yeah, not enough political will, corruption, a big issue in some places. Awesome. Thank you. And moving on, what do you think, besides those challenges, what do you think, or what have you observed as some of the advantages of retrofitting? Awesome. Um, thanks for these cost benefit compared to cost of constructing a new house. As we're writing in some of these advantages, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Lizzie, who will take over. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Oluwaseun, and thanks everyone for your thoughts on the advantages of retrofitting. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we've found as some of the advantages to post-disaster retrofitting programs. First, talking a little bit about what are the shorter term benefits or sort of the immediate benefits in the post-disaster housing recovery, and then a little bit more about the longer term benefits. So in the shorter term, it's a cost-effective solution to having safer housing available to homeowners and people who may have lost housing. On average, it's around 1/4 the cost of new construction we've found. We did a study looking at over 1,000 different retrofit case studies and the costs for those retrofits. We also found that it addresses multiple concerns in the house. So people are able to not just do disaster mitigation, which we found to account for around 60% of the cost of the work, but they're also able to do other things, accounting for the other 40% of the cost of the work, including structural repair, habitability improvements, finishes, and potential for future vertical expansion. It also avoids delay in the process. So oftentimes we found there to be less bureaucracy and less delay when you're dealing with an existing structure than when you have to look at procuring a new site or clearing an existing site, which can sometimes cause some delay. We've also found that it increases homeowner satisfaction because the retrofitted house is a safer, better version of the house that the homeowner or the occupants had in the first place, one that they used in a functional way. And for example, this homeowner here, she ran her tailoring business out of her house. And so through repairing and retrofitting her home, we were able to also maintain the function of that space for her business. You're also able to avoid permanent relocation. We've worked in retrofit programs where houses that had been damaged were retrofitted and expanded, and homeowners were then able to return from a temporary camp they were living in back to their house with more space for additional people to join as well. And it also allows, as long as the sites are safe and you don't have non-mitigatable site-related hazards, you don't need to necessarily relocate people into new areas, and you can avoid the social and economic consequences associated with relocation. And so those are some of the shorter term benefits, and we can go now to some of the longer term benefits we found with post-disaster retrofitting programs. We've found that it's effective in improving the safety, and of course there's an immediate benefit, but there's also a long-term benefit. Going back to the Ignite panel this morning, they were talking about how can we do things during the aftermath of a disaster to prepare and build resilience for the future. And retrofitting is not just repairing, it's building back better on an existing building. And so you're reducing the vulnerability of that building and that family to future hazards. And also you're able to reduce the environmental impact of reconstruction because you're using as much of the existing building as possible. You're not using unnecessary materials. And you're also in the future preventing that loss of the building again in another, let's say, hurricane or typhoon. Further, you can find that it supports urban densification. A lot of times people in urban areas have visions of expanding their home, and retrofitting allows the opportunity to do that safely. You can retrofit a single-story house so that in the future it can accommodate safely a vertical expansion. We've also found that it changes the embedded construction practices. The training, the work, the awareness that gets built through disaster-resistant construction practices through a retrofitting program can last into the neighborhood as people continue to do work for their neighbors into the future. This is an example of a builder on the right here who was working on a house following disaster-resistant construction practices outside of a project after he had become aware of those practices through the project itself. So I want to shift gears now from the general advantages of retrofitting. We're going to go through some case studies. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the experience we had in Haiti. My colleague Leva will talk about Nepal, and Louise will talk about St. Martin. And we're going to look at the three barriers: technology, money, and people, and what the case studies looked like and what parts of what were the outcomes and some of the key takeaways from the programs. In Haiti, there were standards that needed to be developed to be catered specifically to the context. At the time of the earthquake, the government did develop quite a few different standards, and they did eventually put out also a retrofitting guide. So that was useful. The capacity in terms of people's technical capacity for retrofitting, builders and field engineers and implementers did need to have training and to learn about retrofitting and how to implement retrofitting projects. We found in our programs that the cash subsidy was typically sufficient as long as it was dispersed per family, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And we were also able to work with partners to have compliance incentives so that funds or grants were distributed in pieces according to construction compliance. So people had to demonstrate they're using the funds well to get the next grant to continue with their project. Homeowners, we found, were often motivated, but like the technical folks, they also needed support in terms of understanding about retrofitting and understanding about purchasing good quality materials and hiring qualified builders. They did need that support. The government generally had a lower capacity for enforcement and to be involved in implementation because there were so many different programs ongoing during the reconstruction phase. And so we oftentimes complemented the government's enforcement through the program technical assistance. And when these elements were in place, we found we were able to achieve a high compliance and completion rate of post-disaster retrofits. Some of the key takeaways from the post-disaster retrofitting projects that we had in Haiti, outside of the advantages that we've already talked about, is that looking at the costs of retrofitting and other alternatives, retrofitting became a viable alternative to T-shelters. So the graph on the right is a study we did in 2014, looking at the average cost per square meter of retrofitting yellow and red tagged houses compared to the cost of new construction and the cost of T-shelters. So on a per square meter basis, you can see that retrofitting yellow tagged houses, even red tagged houses, was more cost effective than other alternatives. We also found that we are able to leverage or unlock the homeowner's investment in their homes. So on the bottom left, you can see the before photo of a house that was retrofit and the after photo on the right. And in the after photo, you can see that the house has really expanded towards the right to enclose the kitchen area that they had before. And that was not part of the retrofit, actually. That was something that the homeowner funded themselves and did during the work of the retrofit. And we found this to be kind of a common occurrence where people would invest more in their home when the work was ongoing to really achieve more and cater it towards their needs. in several of our programs, we also found that it was a way to introduce the homeowner to the banking sector. So when homeowners receive funds for the construction, in some cases they had to open a bank account with which they would receive the funds, and then they were able to then have a savings account for future use beyond the project. And we also found, as I mentioned before, that it was important to assign the subsidy for the retrofit by family and not by building, because in urban areas in Haiti, we found that frequently there are multi-family buildings that were large and housed many different families, and if we offered the same subsidy to that building as to a much smaller, say, single-family building, that the retrofit work couldn't quite go quite as far as we would like. But by looking at individual families and housing units within a building and potentially assigning the subsidy that way, you're able to tackle and really reduce risk in those larger structures. I'd like to go to a poll thinking about sort of retrofitting versus repair in the resource mobilization. In terms of the required resources, for a program, do you think a retrofitting program would be similar or different to a repair program? I'd like to understand from the audience. Somewhat similar. Very different. Almost the same. So the majority of people think that's somewhat similar. Now, what if we move to comparing retrofitting to a new construction? Oh, we're still getting some answers. What about comparing new construction to a retrofitting program? With the resources that need to be mobilized, the human resources, the financial, do you think they would be almost the same, somewhat similar, or very different? Here, there's a bit more feeling that it would be different, although the majority is still somewhat similar. Can we share? Let me share. Someone's asking for the pooling links. Yes, Monica pasted them at the top of the chat, but let me repaste that. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Okay, well, thank you everyone for your inputs. We're going to be, of course, sharing the outcomes of all these polls and surveys when at the end of the session with the shelter cluster. So thank you all for contributing to this. I'm going to hand it over to our next presenter. We'll have Leva, who will talk a little bit about the experience in Nepal.
Thank you, Lizzie. So I will be presenting the case study of retrofitting after the Gorkha earthquake in Nepal. So looking at the technology side, retrofitting is not part of the National Building Code. Post-earthquake guidelines for retrofitting of like major housing typologies and later ready-to-use guidelines such as the Repair and Retrofit Manual and strong back-tight designs were approved, which greatly served to expedite the retrofit design and grant disbursement process. Builders with capacity to retrofit was non-existent in the rural area. During the reconstruction phase, more than 1,600 engineers and 2,200 builders were trained on retrofitting techniques. On the money side, cash grants were provided by the government for retrofitting, but it was much lower than what was provided for reconstruction. However, the grant for reconstruction could only afford a small one-room house, whereas the retrofit could afford a safe 2.5-story house, which is much more suitable for their agrarian lifestyle. Homeowners could access the cash grants only upon compliance of the retrofit works to the standards provided. On the people side, the retrofit beneficiaries could switch to reconstruction if so desired, and there was no requirement that the existing house needs to be demolished. So when the homeowners had to choose between whether to retrofit or to reconstruct, for a house that was not too damaged, most homeowners naturally opted for switching to reconstruction and build a small one-room shed on the side. They would then repair their damaged house and keep using it. The government engineers were initially reluctant to push retrofitting forward due to the lack of clear directives on how to process the government grant for retrofitting, which was later sort of resolved with the help of the ready-to-use design guides and trainings. Um, Next slide, please. So in March 2021, the National Reconstruction Authority, together with key partner organizations who worked on retrofitting, came together to document lessons learned during the reconstruction, as well as to strategize the way forward. Some of the key takeaways were that retrofitting should be included in the National Building Code, where guidance for designing retrofits were important. It was also deemed extremely important to have more ready-to-use designs to enable mass replication of retrofitting. Poor access to finance was realized as a major barrier to effective promotion of retrofitting. Retrofitting should be made more accessible by allowing it to happen in incremental stages. In addition, the government needs to also look into incentivizing financial institutions to introduce loan provisions for retrofitting. A functional supply chain needs to be established for construction materials that are specific to retrofitting. This should be done in coordination with suppliers and also in conjunction with the awareness building campaign so that the demand is there to drive the supply. Extensive awareness campaigns needs to be organized at all levels, from the central government and the local government bodies to the homeowners and builders, so that there is demand for retrofitting. Policymakers should make retrofitting a high priority as a preventative measure to prepare for future disasters, as well as to have policies and plans in place to ensure that retrofitting is given priority right from the start and included in the government housing programs. Retrofitting should be a part of the engineering and vocational training curriculum so that engineers and builders are comfortable implementing it both pre and post disaster. A guild of engineers and builders trained in retrofitting during reconstruction would be instrumental in promoting the technology in future. Next, please. So let's take a poll on what ways have you found most effective for building awareness with homeowners about programs or technical topics for housing recovery. Okay, so there's a tie between okay, so community meeting and theaters, and the second contender is the direct outreach, like SMS door to door, etc. Okay, looks like more people think that direct outreach is more effective. And the third contender is the program participation or training. So I think majority of people think that direct outreach and community meeting theaters are I think more effective tools, awareness building tools. Okay. Thank you. So I would like to hand over to my colleague Louise for the case study on St. Martin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Leva. So yes, our final case study today is a housing reconstruction case study from St. Martin, following the devastation caused by Hurricane Irma in 2017. I think this case study is slightly different from the previous two. It's a bit smaller in scale. It also is hurricanes, it's not earthquakes this time. It's still ongoing, as you can see on the numbers there. They're through about 50 of 120 planned houses. And finally, and I think most importantly here, this is a government-driven project. It's not homeowner reconstruction. So this project was established by the Government Reconstruction Task Force, the NRPB. And although homeowners needed to be motivated, they needed to initially apply to be part of this program. After that, they're not in control. Everything is managed by the NRPB and no money goes through the homeowner's hands. All the construction work is done by a single contractor. The advantages to this, I think, are quite particular to St. Martin. The low capacity of national government enforcement in terms of permitting and construction monitoring could be overcome because the NRPB was able to develop specialized fast-track systems for that. And then similarly, the kind of very low capacity that St. Martin has, and I think in many ways similar to many other small island developing states due to their small populations, has a very small labour pool, and particularly there are few skilled professionals with retrofitting experience. And then they also have that reliance on imported materials. So again, in this case, it made sense because the NRPB was able to manage all of these kind of financial and technical aspects. If you could flick to the next slide, I'd like to just share a couple of key takeaways with you from this program. Firstly, quite a simple point, but I think it's worth making, that post-disaster retrofitting is equally applicable to hurricane damaged buildings as earthquake damaged buildings. Secondly, that retrofitting can also work with government or donor-driven responses. It's not just designed to work with homeowner-driven responses. And then related to this, or to both of those first 2 points, is that retrofitting can pair quite well with repair programs. This was particularly clear, I think, in St. Martin in a post-hurricane context, where there are a lot of masonry buildings with lightweight roofs, and it's common for the roof to fly or the roof to fail and the walls to remain, at which point it's really quite easy to do some simple strengthening measures to the walls, to the masonry, the most common being to add a ring beam to tie them all together nicely before you put on your shiny new roof repair. That said, and a common challenge that we've experienced is there is a slight cost increase with retrofitting projects when compared to repair projects. And as with all our projects, fixed budgets, and I'm sure you're all far too aware that any cost increase is going to be a big concern for that donor or for that government partner. But ultimately, in our experience, with some kind of technical support in making that decision, donors and governments, and in this case at Martin, they were convinced that retrofitting measures were a worthwhile investment, and have chosen to include them. A key reason in the case of St. Martin was making it clear that if you put a nice shiny new roof on, that's nice and strong and much stronger than the original roof, it may actually make the building more vulnerable to future events as you're changing the load path and possibly causing failures to exist in the walls in the future rather than in the roof. So with this discussion on kind of implementation methods and homeowner-driven versus government or donor-driven, I'd like to do a quick poll of your experience. So just to be clear, homeowner-driven here, we're talking about homeowners making decisions on architecture and design. They're choosing who the builder is, and they're probably supervising the work themselves and paying the builder themselves with the help of a grant or subsidy. And then donor-driven is international agencies, local agencies, or governments. They're generally making the decisions, giving homeowners a limited number of plans to choose from. and hiring large-scale contractors to carry out the work and managing all the finances. Of course, there are advantages and disadvantages to both, but we're interested to hear your response to this. Looks like everyone's very pro homeowner driven so far. Interesting. Yeah, okay. 100% homeowner driven. I think that certainly agrees with our experience. I'll hand you over now back to my colleague, Lizzie, who is just going to wrap up in a few minutes.
Great, thank you, Louise. So let's shift to how can we facilitate post-disaster retrofitting? How can we make a post-disaster retrofitting project successful? First, I'd like to ask or invite you all to say, what have you, from your experience, what is a key lesson or recommendation you have for others who want to implement a post-disaster retrofit program? Does anyone have any suggestions or recommendations that you can share? Preparing for and knowing the context. Yes, I think definitely. That's a great one. Does anyone else have any nuggets of wisdom? Listen to the client group. Technology, yeah. Preparation and awareness. Great. Awareness, yep. Contact will change, that's funny, thank you. But I think that we have a primer on post-disaster retrofitting that we developed for USAID that is linked in our resources here. And our objective is to not have Build Change do all the post-disaster retrofitting, but to help others to do post-disaster retrofitting and to scale the effort. Understanding local needs, yeah. Reconnaissance, to understand context. A lot of information here about understanding the context and creating awareness and participation. So I think those definitely fall into some of the recommendations that we would have as well. So I'm going to go through these quickly because we are running out of time, but Louis-Sean will be sharing contact information and we'd love to talk more about this. So why don't we go to the next slide, and I'm just going to summarize here. Of course, we have it separated by people, money, and technology are three barriers to housing resilience. So I think in summary, if we look at people, we really want to integrate in policies. We want to integrate retrofitting from the start. So make it part of the plan from the start and make sure that we're bringing the homeowner along in the process. So I think that reflects a lot of the inputs that you had in terms of creating awareness, planning, preparation from the start when we're looking at a disaster that has just occurred, already acknowledging and preparing for retrofitting to be part of that reconstruction process. I think that's a key element to facilitating post-disaster retrofitting. And you can see some of the more detailed information here. I'll skip that and move on to the next slide, which we're going to talk about money. And I think the big picture here is making sure that retrofitting is incentivized equally to other options, or better. A lot of times it affords more space, more living space for the cost. And so how can we make sure that it's equally incentivized and that the use of funds are optimized? So prioritizing intervention and using some of those conditional financing to improve quality. I'm going to leave it there since we're running out of time and go to the next thing, which is technology. And here the big picture really is keep it simple and leverage existing knowledge from the start. Don't get stuck in a bottleneck of research or thinking that retrofitting needs to be complex. It can be simple and you can get started. And you can use technology to facilitate that. So thank you, everyone. And I'll hand it back over to Louis-Sean.
Thanks, Lizzie, and thanks, Louise and Leva, for helping me with this. I know we're out of time already, but I would like to close the session by leaving with an open-ended question. And that's in what ways can we move beyond a post-disaster retrofitting as we've seen here? How can we take the lessons learned and understanding the challenges and advantages in retrofitting and bring them to maybe a preventative situation? Um, so just food for thought. I'd also like to just reiterate that, as Lizzie said, we do have some resources to help better understand retrofitting and how to move forward with retrofitting programs. You can find them on this website as well as the event page. Um, and if anybody has any other questions or would like to continue this discussion, or even just to say hi, please feel free to reach out to me. My name is, again, Oluwaseun Oksanya, and this is my email. Thank you, everybody, and take care.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Great session.
Yep, thanks, everybody.